Welcome to another episode of Rose Resource Room. Today I am here with Djerica, who I actually met at the CHAP convention in June last year. Good morning, love. How are
Good
you?
morning.
Welcome to the show. Please introduce yourself. Tell me all the things that make you amazing and tell me about yourself before being a wife and mom. And then you can
Oh,
bring the kids and the husband in.
okay. Great. My name is Djerica Jasmine. So who am I? You're before I'm a mom. I'm like, I haven't even thought about that really,
Right.
but I'm a nurse. I was a nurse before I got married and became a mom. I used to work in the ICU, and in transplant. So that was like my specialty. And I started in Massachusetts. That's where I'm from. I grew up in Boston, and my family's originally from Haiti. So we were raised in New England. And over the years after I graduated, I moved to New York City and kind of like started a life out here and worked within the different hospitals around New York. And then later we ended up getting married and moving to New Jersey. And so, yeah, so I kind of just started off as as a nurse. I really kind of just had like aspirations within healthcare. Um, and and yeah, that's
All right. So
it.
tell me about the babies. How old are the babies?
So my kids are 4, 2, and 1. The 2-year-old is going to turn 3 like in 2 or 3 weeks. The 4-year-old is turning 5 in March.
Okay. Very,
Yeah.
very nice.
Yeah.
All right. So you decided to homeschool. You have these babies who aren't even really school age yet, right? Like we can wait it out if you want to, or you could start
Yeah.
early if you want to. But you and your husband decided to homeschool. What was that conversation like? What took you down that path?
Yeah. So it really started in 2019.
Okay.
I I made the decision then. So we got married um May of 2019. When we were engaged, I'll go back
Yeah.
to our salvation. So
Okay.
both of us got saved 2018. And we were and when we came into Christ, we came into a robust community of believers and really a really big focus on discipleship
Mm,
and evangelism. And so that's how I came into Christ. I came in with a just a beautiful body and of Christ. And so as and there was lots of women who were just godly women who were homeschooling, who were in the home. And it was the first time I had ever seen that. And
mm,
so as we know, I'm getting prepared to get married. I didn't even know, we had no idea about like, when we're gonna have kids and all that stuff.
yeah.
But I was watching them and I noticed that everybody homeschooled. And I just asked, like, hey, like, why do you guys homeschool? Like, what's the benefit? Because I know there are some people who were exposed to homeschooling before, like, and maybe they may have had like some impressions,
Right.
but I can say I was one of those people. I had no impressions about homeschool. Like I just didn't
Yeah.
even I had never formulated an opinion
Right.
of it. I think I met one homeschooler while I was in college, and I never thought about it. I maybe thought about it in the moment that they
Yeah.
said homeschooled for 15 seconds, and then after that, that's it. I just never met anyone. I never formulated an opinion. So now I'm in this setting where I see all these people homeschooling their children, and I'm like, hey, like, what is it? Um, and at the time, I was given this, they kind of explained like, hey, man, we just want to be the ones who, raise our children and,
Hmm.
and disciple them and, and instill the things of God in them. And one of the women, she shared with me essentially it was a recording of Vadi Bashan's like talk. And I'm sure
Wow.
it's now I know it's like a classic, like
Right.
homeschool, talk. And I listened to that, and it was via a podcast. I think it was like a recording of a podcast. And so I listened to that, and that ignited like something in me. I was a brand new
Mm,
believer, wasn't even a mother yet. I think I was maybe 2 months away from being married. And so it was like literally just like I knew like this is what I want.
Wow.
And so that's how it started. And honestly, it was one of those experiences where I had a lot of opinions about schooling in
Yeah.
general.
Yeah.
I had because I had like when I was living in New York, in the single lives, I had friends who worked at charter schools. I had a lot of experience with like public school because I went
Mhm.
to public school. My brother sent our my nieces to private school,
Right.
very elite private schools in Massachusetts. So I had a lot of opinions about schooling. And
Yeah.
so for me, when I found out about homeschool, it felt like freedom. Like it felt like, oh,
Wow.
another option that I could do. I didn't realize that this was an option. I only thought of public school, private school, charter school, and I wasn't a fan of any of them really.
Mm.
And um so I just so for me it was just like that's kind of how it started. That's how the seed got planted through that Vadi Bashan teaching, and just when he went through all the facts and all the statistics, it just like faith arised in me that I'm like, oh, I know that I believe this, and I know that this is something possible. And so now fast forward, we get married, and and this was my experience, and so I chat with my husband about it at the because we ended up we got married in May, and by July we were pregnant. And
Oh,
so
wow.
it was fast. Like we're like, okay, we're this is happening. And
Right.
we were pregnant with our first, and so when we as we started talking about, I was like, man, I think I want to homeschool. And that it was something that I just thought about. I knew it was a while, before I got to that place, but.
Hmm.
Um, he was more like, okay, like I'm not sure because he went to like a
Like, we'll
big public
see.
school. Yeah, he went to a big public school in Massachusetts, and I think he had experiences with homeschool, um, like interactions where he felt like there was some awkwardness or
Okay.
social awkwardness, and so he had more opinions around the matter than I did.
Hmm.
So it was definitely just a topic, but as we kind of got closer to the time frame, and I just, I did the hustle of like, daycare and work and dropping the kids off and he's dropping them off and then going, and I lived that life. I learned very quickly like this is not feasible. Like my young children, I don't want to like drop them off and then pick them up and then make dinner and then go to sleep. Like I just felt like that was our life.
Yep.
And for a few years when the children were really young, and I was like, man, I don't like this. I don't like this feeling. And I feel like it just felt very burdensome and it didn't feel like
Mm.
natural. And so,
Mm.
so as this year came, we had our third. So we had like 3 kids in 3.5 years. And so this year we had our third. And it just kind of made sense. Like, hey, like, we can, we can, we should just like bring them home and just get prepared, to just be home and homeschool,
Wow.
because it's like it's no longer feasible when you're paying for daycare and all these other things, and it's like yes, I'm working, but I'm also working to pay somebody else
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
to watch my kids,
Yeah.
and then you see when they get into other environments, you see the habits that they pick up.
Mm.
So you see kind of like, oh wow, like where are you getting that from? And you see how they get they're so easily influenced by their peers. And
Hmm.
so that was something that I that kind of all shaped our opinion, and even meeting at the CHAP conference like you mentioned, we when we got there, I wasn't even gonna go, like, because I felt like, oh, I'm too soon, this is
Too
too soon.
early, right?
It was like my oldest was 4, and I was like, yeah, I guess this is a little too early, like I think I should be doing this in a year or two. And what my husband, and he encouraged me. He said, honestly, you should go now because this would be like an orientation.
Mm.
And I was like, okay, what do you mean by that? And it's like, yeah, like you should use it as a way to introduce yourself to what it takes so you can prepare. And I'm really grateful that he encouraged me that way because it was
Oh
just a
yeah.
great orientation. So it didn't feel like I was rushed to
Right.
like make a decision, do anything. It felt like I had time to do
Mm,
research. I had time to understand more and ask more questions. And that's what I've done. Like since we've been there, I've just formulated more of a thought process of like, okay, what is it going to look like for me?
right.
And that's been really good.
That's awesome. So there's so much to unpack there. Like I didn't even know that you lived in New York City. I lived in Brooklyn, Bronx, and Queens,
Oh wow.
and Manhattan. So at some
Oh
point,
yeah.
or
I
past
live
probably crossed.
I live our Harlem in Brooklyn. So
Oh, where
that's
were you in Harlem?
my
I was 128th and 5th.
oh, I was 121st and in Lennox.
Oh my gosh.
And actually, and at one point I lived on 129th and 5th, actually.
Oh,
I remember.
oh wow.
Yeah.
That is so interesting. Um, yeah, and then, so we're both Jersey transplants now.
Yeah.
And then you talked about like you didn't have an impression. Same thing for me. I never had a thought about it. For me, I just knew I was going to get married, have our children, move to a decent area where we're paying enough taxes that the schools are good, and then put them in public
Yeah.
school. And then when you talked about being Haitian, like that hit for me too, because as you know, I'm Jamaican and education is very important to us as Caribbean women. And
Yes.
like that's not something that we know of. Like, right, you just send the kids to the school, they go
Yeah,
to
it's
college, and
true.
that's literally it. Um, one difference for me is I wouldn't say that I was a reluctant homeschooler, but my husband is the one who caught the vision first. This
Oh
was
wow.
pre-COVID. We started talking about it. But the way he introduced it is we would live in Jersey, we would continue to work in New York City, and someone would come into the home to school the kids. And I was like,
Mhm.
oh, it's like having a tutor or whatever. I'm like, okay, that
Yeah.
sounds great. And then literally COVID happened. I still wasn't like, okay, I have to do this. I was like, okay, we're sticking to the plan. And then in 2021, I quit my job to build my coaching business. And I heard so clearly that I was supposed to pull my older, I'm going to say older because at the time I had two. So, but right now I have three, my oldest,
Mhm.
out of school. And then I was like, God, yeah. So I'm building my business. I'm not really, yeah, that's not what we're doing
Yeah.
here, right? But it wasn't one of those things where you're like, oh, Jerica, I think God is trying. No, I was
I was like,
crystal clear. I
yeah.
knew. So I went to my husband. I was like, babe, God wants me to homeschool like me doing it. He's like, okay, right. So that was literally the start of it. So I love how you and your husband talked about the preparation and the orientation because you don't feel like you're thrown into something. You don't feel rushed. You feel like you have time to figure it out. And then you can figure out the purpose and the why and your philosophy and your approach and all that
Yeah.
versus, oh my gosh, here we are. But one thing, well, two more things. And then you talked about the daycare. I remember dropping off my kids at like 7 o'clock in the morning, jetting on a bus to head into the city by 8:15, and then like the stress of getting back on time. And then you pick them up. Hey, how are you? Here's some food. Here's your bath. Let's read a book. I was like, I'm a part-time mom. This is,
Yeah.
you talked about it not feeling natural. And I'm like, one, this schedule does not work with my schedule. And two, it doesn't feel natural. Like the natural thing to do is how you did it in terms of, hey, baby, that's a bird versus me, who I'm always like, what curriculum do you use? What curriculum? You, it really resonated with me when you said what stood out to you in the church was the discipleship. And a lot of us bring our babies home because we want to disciple them, we want to teach them things, but then it ends up being the curriculum. Well, how did you teach them how to do this? How do you teach them how to do that? And then the important thing that we actually wanted to hone in on, we completely forget that and that goes to the side. Or we do Bible time, we do devotion time, then we do the real stuff, right? So I guess I would ask you, like, what does that look like for you with babies so young? And then eventually, when they get older, how do you plan to use this period for discipleship versus what I'm guilty of doing sometimes, which is making it more about the academic piece and then trying to fit God in? Like, what does that look like for you in your head?
Yes, and that is something that I've considered a lot. Like, and I talk to my husband about it all the time. Like, man, like I really want to make sure the first things are first and that I'm focusing on the right thing. Because I know I'm, just come from being a nurse, like I could be very like, okay, this, and that, we
Checklist.
need to
Yep.
learn this, that. And one of the things that I am planning on is and we actually already do this and we have a lot of conversation with our children. So our 4-year-old, he's very observant. We talk to him a lot. We answer his questions. Like we already have a lot of conversation with him about God. And he's also witnessing us live out this life in Christ. I mean, we are surrounded by the church. We have people all the time in our space, and we're in other people's space. And so he sees the church in motion. Like he sees it. He sees when someone needs prayer. He sees when we're mourning. He sees when we rejoice. He sees when we give thanks. And so I feel like, and he asks questions like after church, he'll come and he'll be like, what did you mean by this? And why is that? And what is it? And he asks all these questions about God. Ever since he turned 4, that was really when he started to like have like an interest about like God and things of God. Like he would literally start to ask like who is God and who is Jesus and why did he die on the cross? And
Wow.
and so it's really something that I know that he has you know we're we're very like I know that he's ripe, and if that's a,
Mm.
for lack of better words, he's
Yeah.
ripe. And so I keep remembering that, like that's literally like my forefront of like we are going to have sons who grow up in the fear of the Lord.
I love that.
And we feel like we need to live our lives where that they want to serve our God. And that's what
Mm.
we're doing. We're like selling them like this life, like this is who you like, this is the life that you want to live. And it's great, it's holy, it's, you know what I mean? And God is with you. Like this is what we're telling them. And I can tell my 4-year-old and my 2-year-old, they've bought in. Like they talk
Ah.
about like mom, like they all want to be like their dad. They're like, I want to be like a dad. I want to grow up. And I want to have a wife. I want to have my kids. Like they're already talking
Oh
about
my
this at
God.
4 years old. And it's just because of like the culture that we've created in the home.
Mm.
And one of the things that we want to focus more on, like especially as I get older, because my oldest, he can't read yet. He's a 4, but I really want to focus on the scripture,
Mm.
reading the scriptures, because he understands way more than I give him credit for. And
Of
so
course. Yeah.
so I just want to make sure that we're washing them with the word of God,
Mm.
that we're bringing them to the word of God when it comes to character, when something comes up, that I'm just going back to the word of God. And one of the books that I read early on, even I've reread it. I've reread it now a few times since we've had kids, but I read it when I first was pregnant. It was called Shepherding a Child's Heart. And essentially he talks about it's the discipleship of a
Hmm.
child, and he talks about how um dealing with the issue not for the surface matter, but
Right.
for a deeper level,
The
and
root.
bringing the child back to the cross, essentially.
Mm.
It's like literally like bringing the child back to the cross of Jesus, and how you have so many opportunities to do that when anything arises, whether it's a conflict with a sibling, whether it's a bad character trait. It's like you have an opportunity to deal with the real matter of, okay, well, right now you're being ungrateful, and this is what God has to say about that.
Mm.
And if you're finding it hard, Jesus can help you, and this is what salvation is. You can really bring it full circle. And so that was something that, again, when I first read it, it like ignited in my heart, like just a faith. And that's what we've been trying to do. And so I think for us, it's gonna be that's I kind of have shared with you already, like I want to do a very slow
Yeah.
to academics. I don't want to overwhelm
Burnout.
academic too much, because I understand just from experience watching so many people homeschool. I've seen the pits and the highs and the lows. So
Mm.
I'm very intentional about starting really slow and at his pace. So and hearing, like kind of listening to be like, okay, well, if he's really struggling with this in understanding this concept, like maybe you just need to take a break, like kind
Hmm.
of understanding that. And so I'm kind of in that, like that's my game plan. And just being just very like aware that my main focus, my main goal is that in 30 years he is a disciple of Jesus Christ.
Oh my gosh.
That is my, like I think of him, like when I look at it, I'm not looking at, okay, what is he,
A
fifth grade,
career.
10th grade career, what is he gonna do? It's like, okay, at 30, is he gonna be a disciple of Jesus? Gonna
Mm.
be a laid down lover of God and servant lover of all. And that's where that's my thought process. So I'm really just trying to keep a long range of him and not necessarily the short range.
Right.
And I got that from that book. I think it was a shepherd. It was two books that I read, Shepherding the Child's Heart and Parenting by the Book. And so
Hmm.
those two books together were just really helpful about like giving me the mind frame and the framework of how I should look at parenting. And I read those very early. And I think
Hmm.
the Lord just gave me the grace because I read these things well before I was in, parenting, but it really
Right.
gave me a foundation and
Of course.
of how to frame my mind because I didn't grow up in a Christian home where I knew where I would have known these things. And so that was really that's been really helpful. And so that's my thought process on the matter.
I feel like what you're doing for your children is what God did for you.
Mhm.
So you had your time to prepare to be a wife and a mom and a homeschooler essentially. Um, and you were able to read all these books and you were able to slowly start to get all this wisdom without even having the opportunity to apply it yet. So I think like when you say you want to work at your kid's pace, it's the same thing. God is like, here, I'm going to give you this information. I'm going to give you these nuggets. It may not resonate yet, but we planted a seed and then eventually we're going to build on it and then you're going to have the practical application. Because like even when you talked about your 4-year-old, if he's not reading right now, that just means he's on his own pace. And one of the beauties of homeschooling is the individualized education. But I know I would get so caught up in looking at standards like, let me just take a peek. Like, I know we're not in public school, but let me just take a peek at what they're doing. Or, well, this curriculum says by this, you're supposed to be on this lesson by this date. And I'm like, the child is an individual because I would teach both of my sons, my older sons, something, and I would see how their brains process information differently. And I'm like, how are people doing this with 15 to 20, 30 kids in a class when people are such individuals and they have different learning styles? Granted, there are not that many different learning styles, but there are that many different personalities, right? So my point is I love the approach that you're doing with your children in terms of making it individualized. And the Christ-centered view is so important, right? Like it's not just let's talk about God for 2 minutes and then let's get into math. It's God is in everything. God is in math because there's order. God is in geography because there's creation. Like,
Yes.
he's literally in everything. And what resonated with me really, really deeply was when he talked about the long goal. So in 30 years, you want to make sure that he is sold out for Christ. And sometimes I think we get caught up in I want my child to be well-rounded. And it sounds good, but if you really think about it, that's almost like saying, I want my kid to be a jack of all trades, but a master of none, right? Like I want them to touch
Yeah.
on a whole bunch of stuff. It sounds great when you say well-rounded, but when you say, well, I want them to be able to play all these sports, I want them to know all these languages, know all these instruments or whatever, like it sounds so good and it sounds like you're building this great upstanding kid with culture and everything. But then if we forget the spiritual part, which is the foundation for them to learn everything else, and we really missed it. So I love, love, love that you have this long-term goal of does my child know who they are? Do they understand their identity? Do they understand the nature of God? Do they understand that they can do all things through Christ? Like
Yeah.
that right there, they can figure out any trigonometry question, any
Yes.
calculus or chemistry, right? Like they can literally do anything once they understand who they are and have that foundation. So kudos to you, sis.
Oh, thanks. You know, when I consider also my mindset on home, like this type of homeschooling, this type of like, okay, slow, take it at a pace. I Part of it is because I draw back from my experience when I came to the US. So I was born in the US, and then my parents raised me for like about 6 years in Haiti. Then we came back. And I remember when I came back, we were living in New York City at the time, and they put me in a school, and I think there was no ELS. I don't know, but I was in a class where everybody spoke English and I didn't. And so I remember just like figuring it out at like 6 years old
Oh
in
my
the
God.
classroom every day. My teacher would speak English, and I just didn't get it. I learned like I say I learned English in like 30 days because I was in that environment
Immersed. Hmm.
and I was immersed and I had to. And I just remember like back then my parents were like, now back then now I'm 6 and I'm in school, and I remember we moved a lot. Like I mean, I think by the time I was like in high school, I had moved like 8 times to different
Hmm.
schools. We moved to Connecticut, then we moved to Massachusetts where we eventually settled. But even when we went to Massachusetts, we moved from different schools.
Oh, wow.
And I just remember just moving to a lot of different schools. And, my parents are immigrants and they don't speak English and
Oh,
they're just working, hustling, and, providing for us. We have a roof over our head. And so I never had any lack. But I just
mm,
remember like, no one was like checking on me, like for school. And did you do this? Did you do that? Oh, is this perfect? I just remember becoming very independent in terms of learning.
yeah,
It was just an expectation, like, hey, we expect you to do well. Like we
right.
have an expectation that you're going to come home with a report that has good grades on it, that your teacher says good things about you.
We
And that
brought you to the water, you better drink.
yeah, and it was very much, and that was what it thought was like, hey, we brought you to America. Like this
Yeah,
is privilege. Like you have a privilege of being here. And so I took that on and I just remember I excelled in school. Like I never had an issue. It was like at the beginning of my schooling with the language, I
yeah.
was a little bit, like I would say like I was a CB student
Hmm.
early on, early elementary. And I don't even remember getting grades, honestly, but I just remember it wasn't like I was some like stellar student in that time. But by the time I was in high school, I was an A student. I was taking AP classes and I graduated top 10 of my class.
Love
And
it.
it was truly, when I look back at it, it's like I just don't remember having a lot of pressure early on. Like
Interesting.
I don't remember having a lot of pressure to perform, pressure to do well in like the first or second grade. And so
Mm,
because of that experience, I know like you don't need to do all that. Like I think because of just my own personal experience, I
yeah,
kind of have a thought like, hey, like you don't need to do that. And and I actually love learning. Like that's one
yeah.
thing that I like learning new things. I like the challenge of
Hmm.
learning something new. I really that's something that I've always had. I've always
But it's
looked
intrinsic though. It's
It
not
was
some,
intrinsic.
yeah.
Yeah. And so that's one thing that I didn't want to do in my children is like squash a love of learning
Mm.
when because of like some structure and some curriculum that says you need to finish this by 2 months. Like, you know what I mean? And
Right.
I didn't want to do that
Yeah.
because especially with what I've learned about boys is that they're a little bit slower paced in terms of learning in general. And so it's like, keep like, you don't want to like let them play and let them learn through play, and ask questions, but like you don't want to squash it. And so that's part of my thought process of like why I feel this way because of my own personal experience, like feeling like, man, like nobody checked in on my school
Yeah.
and I was a good steward of it because I just like to learn and it was something
Yeah.
intrinsic. So I just want to foster that same type
Hmm.
of mentality in my
Yeah.
children.
I hear you 100% because I remember having so many conversations with people like, what happens at third grade? You see these kids, they're like thirsty for knowledge, they want to learn, they're raising their hands. First and second grade, they're eager. And then third grade comes around and something kills their love for learning. And it's exactly
Yeah.
what you just said. My friends who were teachers at the time would say the standardized testing comes in at that time. So at
Mhm.
this point, I can't use props, I can't use humor, I can't use all these other elements, I have to teach to the test. That's what I
Yeah.
have to do. You're
Wow.
starting to get tested. You need to understand how to pass this test. That's it. I don't
Yes.
care about the fun stuff. I don't care about anything else. And that's what you said in terms of squashing. We went from like these Socratic discussions and the wondering and the curiosity to pass the test. Like get the
Yes.
and,
Yeah.
and and then some of it is not even learn it and understand it enough to pass the test. It's like, I'm gonna teach you how to pass this test. That's literally it. And I
Yeah.
think that's what happened. So like with my boys, I'm like so like trying to find that balance between, okay, these are things that you need to understand, but we can do this at a different pace, or if this is where you excel and we can speed up here and then slow down over here. And like I said, just really make it individual. So Djerica, I asked you a ton of questions today. What are some final thoughts you have? What's something you'd want to share or something that you've been thinking about?
Oh, wow. What have I been thinking about? Think about it. I would say I've really been thinking about the culture of a home, right? Fostering the right environment, the right, breeding ground for a Christ-centered home and what that could look like in terms of like creating just a really rich Christian heritage. Because I think about, man, like I'm the first believer in my family and I think about, and then my husband, he's not the first believer in his family, but we're definitely in a place where our like the way that we express our faith and discipleship and our commitment to God is unique in both of our families. And so it's really one of those things where now I just consider like, man, how do we build this culture where now our three sons would then raise families onto God, like literally just seeing like our entire like generational line completely in in a new direction for Christ. And it starts with just really disciplined and simple. It starts with intentionality in our home so that so that they can reproduce it as they grow. And so those are the things that I've been thinking about, like just that Christian culture in the home and the like that Christian heritage that, our children are so blessed to be a part of. Like, I mean, I think about my son and I'm like, you're so lucky. Like you like, like it's just crazy because I'm like, I think about all like I just didn't have this. I didn't have godly wisdom and godly counsel at that age. And I'm just like, man, you are already like 10 miles ahead of me. You know what I mean? And I'm just grateful. I'm just so grateful that that God has blessed me to be able to do that. And so that's what I've been considering.
That is so beautiful. And it just shows God's faithfulness in terms of, I mean, you came out all right. Like you're okay, right? You came out
Yes.
so well. And God is like, listen, you may not have had this foundation, but I'm going to equip you with what you need. And I'm
Yeah.
trusting you to instill these in your three boys. So it just shows God's faithfulness. Thank you so much
Yeah.
for sharing.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Of course, it was my pleasure having you, love, and thank you for sharing your gems and your wisdom and like all these nuggets. And for any other parent who's on the fence about it, listen, you get to curate a beautiful experience. It doesn't have to be the way I do it. It doesn't have to be the way Jerica does it. You, God, and your husband or your wife, depending on who's listening, you get together and figure out what it needs to look like in your life and for your house. And I love, Jerica, how you talked about culture because sometimes we look at it from the big picture of like societal culture and then we look at the corporate culture, but there's a culture in the house and we get to curate that and we get to create that beautiful tradition and what we think is important for a family. So thank you for sharing all this wisdom. It's my pleasure having you.
Yes. Thank you. Thank you.